present to you is a story written by Michael Bannister in the early 80s. It's kind of about someone who has compulsive neurotic obsessions, and it's about a small town.
A little apprehensive today as she turned on her TV set to watch the soap operas that she watched dutifully every day and which seemed to control her very dull life in the small town of Hicko, Texas. Actually, she was apprehensive most of the time when it came to the soaps and spent her evenings looking forward to the next day so she could find out what was going to happen from the previous day of watching. Janine spent hours and hours in front of her TV watching and watching as if it and her were somehow having a secret affair without her husband knowing. No big deal, she thought to herself. He'll never find out. The only problem was that Janine couldn't stop watching even if she tried. She had become obsessed. It was like that in the small towns of America. These minor obsessions seem to grow into major obsessions and eventually take hold of someone completely until it finally spilled over out of themselves and onto the rest of the world. And of course, nobody ever noticed their own obsession by themselves, so it was easy to see why the world had become one giant obsession. Janine herself had gotten so caught up in her soap opera addiction that she was well on her way to becoming obliterated by herself, and of course, no one noticed. There were others around town who had their own obsessions going full blast. Take the case of Zippy, who lived down the road from Janine and had convinced himself that he was allergic to everything. He finally ended up becoming obsessed with the idea that he was allergic to his own body. Zippy tried in every way to cure himself, only to find that he was running this way and that in hopes of getting as far away from himself as possible. Meanwhile, on the other side of town lived Morbid Morris, who also had his own private obsession going. His was one of constantly thinking of the inevitability of death. Everywhere he looked, he saw the process of death in slow motion. He had decided finally that if God existed, he must be a ruthless murderer who created everything just to sadistically watch it die, which of course meant that we must all be masochists whether we liked it or not. All these people went on and on with their obsessions day in and day out, not even noticing that they were obsessed. Finally, one day, Janine was turning the TV set onto her favorite soap opera of all called Tears in the Ears when a dull sensation quietly came over her. Was she in the TV as part of the soap opera, or had her life become the same as the TV show? She couldn't tell anymore. The soap opera had become her, and she had become the soap opera. It was kind of confusing at first, not being able to tell which was which, but after a moment it didn't matter anymore. Later that day, she went to turn off the last of the soaps on her TV, but somehow, in her confusion, ended up turning off her life instead. She never even noticed. Meanwhile, Zippy had just about run himself into the ground trying to get away from his body. He looked down to see his body running off in one direction and his soul going the other. The only problem was that he couldn't tell which one was the real him anymore. Morbid Morris, on the other hand, had decided that the only way for him to avoid dying, the way everything else seemed to, was to merge with God and become a ruthless, sadistic murderer. He was now busily engaged in killing everything in sight. One day, a stranger was passing through town when it occurred to her that this would be the perfect place to settle down and raise a family. It was such a nice, quiet little town, so free from the obsessions of the rest of the world. While she stood there contemplating how wonderful it would be to move here, she happened to take the mirror out of her purse, which she always carried everywhere, and looked at her reflection, which she did quite often under the pretense of putting on some lipstick or fixing her hair. No big deal, she thought to herself. Vanity is just a small habit that most women have. Just a small habit, she thought once again as she walked into the ladies' room of the bus station to find an even bigger mirror.
Well, that was a quiet little town.